It's back. Grammar lesson number 6, part 2, How to Ruin Your Favorite Children's Books, continues. In the first video, we covered several sentences. In this last one, we're only going to cover a couple. But this next sentence we're going to talk about really, I'll be honest, it threw me for a loop for a little while. So just a note of reassurance to you. If you ever come across a sentence that you don't entirely understand, that's okay. As you'll probably hear me say a lot, especially if you're in a face-to-face class, English kind of sucks. So it's tough to get all the rules, and I actually was up until about 1:30 last night trying to figure out exactly how this next sentence worked and how I could explain it to you in a way that makes sense. So if you're ever confused by a sentence, don't feel like you're stupid, because even people with degrees in English don't always understand things on the first look. So let's take a peek at this next sentence. Let's watch the world together in rain or snow or shine. Now that doesn't really look like a very complicated sentence. In fact, we can eliminate that whole second page, in rain or snow or shine, because we know it's a prepositional phrase, right? Preposition in, 3 objects, rain, snow, or shine. We've seen that in other videos. Nothing too fancy there. But it's that first part that gets a little tricky, okay? And it's for a few different reasons. We have let's, and then we have watch. And actually let is a verb, and so is watch. And then let is contracted because let's is actually a form of let us. And so it gets a little complicated trying to figure out what the subject is, what the verb is, are there objects, are there not, what's going on. So this is when I began my epic Google quest that kept me up late, literally. So let's take a look. To talk about this sentence, I'm going to introduce a few new terms. As usual, the terms are not really important. They're not something you're going to be quizzed on, but they're what things are called. And so since I'm the English teacher and since I have to refer to these things, I'm going to choose to refer to them by their proper names. So first thing we're going to talk about is called an implied subject. Then we'll cover direct objects, which we've dealt with before. We've talked about objects of verbs. There are such things as direct objects. That's most of what we've covered. And then there are things called indirect objects. There's the infinitive. And then there's this causative verb. And that's like a scary looking word, but don't be worried. Not going to quiz you on that term. So let's get to it. Implied subjects. These are subjects that do not actually appear in the sentence. Okay? So to segue into this, think to yourself about what the shortest sentence in the English language could be. Okay? Remember, we need a subject, a verb, capital letter, punctuation, and we need to express a complete thought. Go, to my knowledge, is the shortest sentence in the English language. It's the shortest verb we have. Now you might think, how can we have a sentence with a subject and a verb if we only have one word? Okay, and that's where this implied subject comes in. What kind of word is go? Go is our verb, so we can check that box off. We have our capital letter, we have our punctuation, we're expressing a complete thought, go, run, get out of here, whatever. But where is our subject? The subject of this sentence is you. Go is an imperative. It's a command, right? So really I'm saying you, go. But in that sentence, the you does not actually appear. So we call this an implied subject. And we refer to it, or we notate it by putting it in parentheses in the front of the sentence. Parentheses, you, go. Okay? So that's what an implied subject is. And so when you have a sentence, such as the one we have here, that begins with let's, the subject of that sentence is the implied you, okay? And it's just one of those weird quirks of the English language. Here are some other examples of sentences that are longer than just one word. Please pass the butter. The subject is the implied you, does not actually appear in the sentence. The verb is pass, and the direct object of the verb is butter. What's receiving the action? The butter. What am I passing? The butter, okay? Please pass me the butter. This is a little bit different. The you, the implied you, is still the subject. The butter is the direct object. And now we have this word me in the middle. And me is what we call an indirect object. So we are going to talk about indirect objects right now. Direct object we've talked about before indirect objects we're going to talk about now, and we will show you the difference between them, okay? I threw the ball. Subject I, verb threw. The answer to the question, what did I throw, is the ball. So ball is our direct object. Here's a slightly funnier sentence. I threw John. Same things at work, right? Subject I, verb threw. The answer to the question, who or what did I throw? John. So John is the direct object. Now I am not strong enough to probably throw anyone named John, but that's our sentence here. But what if we combine these two sentences in a way, okay? I threw John the ball. Now, what is the thing I am throwing? The answer to that question is the ball. So the direct object is the ball. It's receiving the action, right? But then the indirect object here is John, and that answers the question, to whom or for whom? So I threw the ball to whom? To John. So when you have an indirect object, it's usually going to appear between the verb and the direct object. Okay, so in this sentence we have subject, verb, indirect object, direct object. I threw John the ball. I passed Sally the butter. Butter is the direct object, Sally is the indirect object. Okay, so now we're getting closer to where we can start talking about this sentence from the children's book. But we still need to identify a couple of other things. The next one is what we call an infinitive. We have talked a lot about prepositional phrases, and many prepositional phrases will begin with to. I walked to the store. Joe went to bed. The quarterback threw to the wide receiver. Okay, these are all prepositional phrases. They start with a preposition to, they end with an object, which is a noun or a pronoun. However, because English is awesome, and the easiest language ever, to can also be used in another way. So we can pair to with a verb, and we call this the infinitive, okay? To finish, to catch, to watch. I was too tired to finish my homework. My hands were too full to catch the glass that dropped out of the cabinet. I want to watch the football game, okay? In that last sentence, the verb is want. I want. Then to watch is an infinitive, okay? And infinitives can serve a lot of different purposes inside a sentence. Okay, so now we're going to combine the last couple of things that we were talking about. I threw John the ball. Here we have subject, verb, indirect object, direct object. Here is a situation where we're using an infinitive, to plus the verb, to serve as the direct object, okay? The teacher, subject, told, verb, Sally, indirect object, to sit down, direct object, in her chair, okay? The teacher told Sally to sit down in her chair. The teacher told what? To sit down. To whom? Sally, okay? So this is a little bit more complicated, and I don't imagine that this is going to sink in right away. That's okay. We have a lot more videos. It's a long semester. That's fine. But I wanted to introduce you to this idea because it's going to come into play in this next sentence that we talk about. Finally, before we address the children's book sentence, we have to learn what this thing called the causative verb is. And do not be frightened of that term. Put a line through it. You don't need to know the word, okay? But this is what it's called. If I knew that's what it was called, my Google search would have been a lot easier last night, but I did not actually know what that term meant. So I learned a little bit something last night, and I'm 31. So just a lesson to you that you're always learning as you go along. So here are some examples of causative verbs. And what we mean by a causative verb is a verb that motivates someone to do something, okay? So the cheering crowd got the runner to sprint toward the finish line. Okay, here we have the verb got, and then we have the infinitive to sprint. In the next couple of examples, we actually don't have the to in front of the infinitive, but we still consider it an infinitive. Again, English, really messy sometimes. But here's an example. My mother-in-law helped me prepare dinner. And then finally our sentence from the book, let's watch the world together. So when we have this sort of we'll call it a motivational verb because I think that makes sense, right? When we have this motivational verb, it follows this pattern. We start with our subject, we have the motivational or causative verb, we have our indirect object, and then we have the infinitive kind of acting as a direct object, and sometimes it will appear with the to, and sometimes it will not. To sprint is the full infinitive, but prepare, we don't have the to in front of it, okay? So now if we look at our example, let's watch the world together. We have the implied subject you, the verb let, the indirect object us, and then the direct object in the form of the short infinitive without the to, which is watch. So if your mind is like blown right now, that's okay. Like I understand this is really tricky. I will never quiz you on something like this. But since we're going through this book and we're talking about sentences, I wanted to present you with that information, okay? In case you're curious, or in case maybe you hear it now and then when we get a few videos down the line or you see another situation, then it begins to make more sense to you. So I didn't just want to withhold it because it's difficult. I don't think that's very good. I would not be doing my job if that were the case. I would have been able to go to bed a lot earlier last night, but I think I would have been giving you the short end of the stick. So now let's get to the book. It's one independent clause. Our implied subject is you. You. The verb is let. The indirect object is us, if you want to think of it as direct and indirect objects. And then the infinitive, which is kind of acting as the direct object here, is watch or to watch. So you let us what? Watch. So, the verb is let us do what? Let us watch. So that's why watch is kind of acting as the direct object here. Again, it's really tricky. And you don't have to get too concerned about this, but I wanted to present you the information. What complicates this even further is this infinitive also kind of has an object. We call it the object of action expressed in the infinitive. That sounds really fancy. But if you just think of, watch is a verb, and so verbs have objects, and so infinitives, which are sort of one way to package a verb, can also have an object. So what are we watching? The world. So the main verb in the sentence has an indirect object and a direct object, and then the infinitive also has an object. So you can see how it doesn't take long for a sentence to become really complicated. And this is in a children's book, right? And I bet that if you just read this sentence, let's watch the world together in rain or snow or shine, you wouldn't think anything of it. It totally makes sense to you. You understand the content. But I'm just trying to point out to you how the mechanics of building this sentence work. And they're far more complicated than you understand at first glance. And again, not anything I expect you to recreate or anything I'll quiz you over, but I just want to point that out to you because I find it interesting, and I don't ever want to get to a sentence and then decide, oh wow, that's too messy or too complicated to explain to the students, so I'm going to skip it. So if this was really dense, I'm sorry, but I hope maybe it makes a little bit of sense to you and that you might find it useful. This last one is a lot easier. I love you always and forever, sweet child of mine. Here again we have I love you, independent clause. Do we have another set of subject and verb? No, we do not. So we have two sets of words going on here. We have always and forever. And what are they doing? They're describing, and what are they describing? They're actually describing the love, right? So these are adverbs, okay? And when we're talking about durations of time, those are typically adverbs. And now we have this phrase at the end, sweet child of mine. You can think of it as one phrase, you can think of it as two phrases if you want. I would call this a noun phrase that uses all of those words, sweet child of mine. And a noun phrase, if you look at the bottom of our box down here, a noun phrase is something that renames a noun or pronoun elsewhere in the sentence, okay? So who is the sweet child of mine? Well, it's the you, right? I love you always and forever, sweet child of mine. So child is basically another way of renaming or restating you. So I could say, Mr. Tote, my English teacher, gave us this bizarre video on a children's book last night. Well, Mr. Tote is our noun and our subject, and my English teacher is the noun phrase that is renaming me, the subject, okay? If that makes sense. And here, our noun phrase actually includes the little prepositional phrase of mine. If you want to be really precise, maybe you would only consider the noun phrase to be sweet child, because child is renaming you, but I think you can get away with saying that the whole noun phrase is sweet child of mine. Anyway, the second video was much more dense. I apologize, but I wanted to present you the information and not just like stop the book because it got a little bit more complicated. So, final takeaways from these two videos. And the things at the top and in bold are the most important things, and then the ones at the bottom are things that we talked about but are not really the hard hitters or the things I expect you to walk away with feeling absolutely confident. I do want you to be able to understand the difference between a phrase and a clause. A phrase is a group of words without a subject and verb. A clause is a group of phrase or a group of words with a subject and verb. I want you to be able to distinguish independent and dependent clauses, okay? Ones that express complete thoughts, that's the independent clause, something that can stand on its own as a sentence, and something that does not, something that begins with the dependent marker word or the relative pronoun or the subordinate conjunction, however you want to refer to them, okay? And then finally, for the big takeaways, I want you to recognize that in some dependent clauses, words like that and who can serve, or that and which, a lot of different words, can serve as both the marker word and the subject of the dependent clause. And we talked about that in the first video. Other things we talked about, and we'll probably return to later in the semester, are the implied subject, this idea of the subject complement, and how it's different from the direct object, the phrasal, which is the verb plus the preposition, the infinitive, which is to plus the verb and how you can use it as a noun, and in this case specifically a direct object. And then the introduction of the noun phrase, which is a way of renaming a noun or pronoun earlier in the sentence. So I know these two videos were a little bit longer. Hopefully they were helpful. If they were like way too difficult to get through, you can always let me know and we can adjust things moving forward. Thanks.